South Africa's president calls for land expropriation without compensation. Is this a radical move to boost a struggling economy, or is he playing politics ahead of next year's election? I'm Maria Ramos, and today's newsmaker is Cyril Ramaphosa's land reforms. South Africa's white minority has long had a disproportionate hold over the country's land, and that was supposed to change when apartheid ended in the early 1990s. But since then, only 10% has been transferred to black owners, and that amounts to a broken promise by the ruling ANC, which said it would give back black farmers 3 times that amount. So how does President Cyril Ramaphosa want to fix the failings of his party? He wants to change the constitution to allow the government to take land from white landowners, and furthermore, the government should not have to pay. He says it will strengthen the economy and expand food security. But if that sounds like a campaign promise, Ramaphosa's critics say it is, ahead of elections next year. With more, here's Natalie Pahonen.
It's been nearly a quarter of a century since the end of apartheid. But the racial and economic disparity between black and white South Africans continues. At the heart of that divide is land ownership, because black South Africans had their lands taken away during colonial rule and then again under apartheid.
It has become patently clear that our people want the Constitution to be more explicit about expropriation of land without compensation, as demonstrated in the public hearings.
President Cyril Ramaphosa is talking about transferring land from white to black owners without paying for it. In December, his ruling African National Congress party declared its support for expropriation without compensation. Since then, there have been a series of public hearings across the country to get input on a possible amendment to the Constitution that would allow it. The report from those hearings hasn't been published yet, but Ramaphosa says change is necessary to boost the economy and increase food security.
I believe land expropriation without compensation is a good thing. That's what the country has been looking for, and the people are asking for it. So why not give what the people are asking for?
That's the kind of feedback the president wants to hear, because next year the country will have a general election, and land is fast becoming a key issue for voters. Land ownership is an economic and emotive issue. The government says blacks own just 4% of privately owned land. That's compared to the 72% in white hands. It's a statistic which cuts across the country, from farmland to urban lots. Successive ANC governments have promised to transfer more territory to black owners. Many South Africans live below the poverty line. They don't have the resources to access land to build a home or a livelihood. It means land reform is something all sides of politics will have to campaign on in 2019. If the Constitution is amended to allow for expropriation without compensation, there is no guarantee the economic benefits will flow evenly across the country, or an idea of how long it would take to redistribute territory. But for black South Africans without a piece of land to call their own, this could be a change that transforms their lives. Natalie Pahonen, The Newsmakers.
Now, to discuss this, I'm joined from Johannesburg by Zanele Luanda. She's the Deputy President of the Black First Land First Party. And in Cape Town is Thomas Walters. He's the Democratic Alliance's Shadow Deputy Minister of Rural Development and Land Reform. And completing our panel is Professor Ruth Hall at the University of Western Cape. Thank you all for joining us. Now, I want to ask, first of all, to start with you, Zanel. Now, a land expropriation law was passed 2 years ago. So why isn't that good enough? Why do we need a constitutional change now?
Greetings to you and to your viewers as well. At the Lands Claim Court, which is situated in South Africa, we have not had a single case where black people who were colonized and dispossessed for their land had actually succeeded in getting their land back without compensating the white minority, which brutally and violently dispossessed the black majority in this country. The Constitution in its current form legalizes land theft on the part of white people who invaded our country and dispossessed our people and enslaved us and oppressed us as the black majority. So the Constitution, as we speak right now, does not respond to the demand of black people that the country, and in particular the land that we live in, must be brought back to the rightful owners. The Constitution, in fact, and in particular people like Advocate Ngugaitobi and the former Chief Justice, which is Mr. Musaneke, have talked a lot about equitable compensation on the part of the victims, which happen to be black people. But if we dig deeper into the issue, this compensation that people are talking about is always translated to the market value of the land. And our position as Black First Land First is that a crime had been committed, and the victims of this crime are black people who were evicted, who were brutalized, and who were killed from their homeland and from the land of their ancestors. So the perpetrators, which still remains the white settler minority, cannot then turn around and demand for the compensation of the land while the land was taken without paying for a cent from its rightful owners, and that is black people. So we are calling, in fact, for the total removal of Section 25. And one of the demands that we are making as Black First Land First is that the land occupation in this country must not be treated as an illegal action, and that farm evictions in particular, as we have seen, that our people have been brutalized and killed in farms that are owned by the white settler minority. No evictions must happen, but in particular, the country in itself and the land in particular must be regarded as stolen property, and property that must be returned to the hands of black people.
Okay. Zanella, thank you very much for that point of view. Now, I want to bring in Ruth Hall, and you look very closely at land policy and rights. And we just heard there from Zanel saying that the Constitution legalizes land theft. Very strong words there. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that what Zanella is saying is absolutely true, which is that colonialism and apartheid constituted land theft in South Africa. And the question is now, what do we as a society do about that? And what we have created in our constitution is actually a system of saying that there should be property rights for both the propertied and the propertyless. And that actually the interests of those who don't have property, those who were dispossessed, should take priority over those who own private property. And the reality is that we have a government that hasn't implemented that. So the difference between Zanella's point of view and mine is not about the history. We agree about the history. The question is it the problem that our government, since 1996, when we had a new constitution, is it the problem that our government has not implemented those laws? Mm-hmm. And it was meant to make sure that people who had claims to land got their land back. And it has not been able to give effect to that.
So surely that should be the place where we fix things, the government fixes things first there?
Well, this is the debate right now, and I think that what's happening in South Africa is now a very deeply racialized and polarized situation where a lot of white people are saying, defend the Constitution, defend our private property rights, and a lot of black people are saying, change the Constitution and let us just take back the land. But in between, what we need to hear from the ruling party, from the ANC, is a clear story of what is the government planning to do? So South Africa is deeply divided on this issue of land right now, but there are lots of opportunities to get this right, even within the framework of our existing constitution, which says that you can expropriate land in the interests of making good on what was done wrong in the past.
Okay.
So we actually have a legal framework to set this right.
Okay, so there is a legal framework as it stands right now to make things right. Thomas Waters, you've been listening to these 2 points of view. What's yours?
Well, look, I think the key problem that my political party, that's the main opposition party in South Africa, has, is that currently the thrust is to amend the constitution for the state to actually have more rights over land. And our party position is we actually want individuals to own property. We want more black South Africans to own property. We don't believe land reform is situated by taking land rights away from citizens and taking it towards the state. In fact, Section 25 of the Constitution is meant to prevent exactly that arbitrary seizure of land by the state. That is, in fact, one of the pillars on which apartheid in South Africa was built on, is the state able to simply trample on the rights of individuals. So our party is there to defend the individual property rights of people. We feel individual property rights must be extended to as many South Africans as possible, and to also, in the process, deal with the legacy of dispossession that we had in South Africa in the past. Okay, and I want to go back to you, Zanele. From far away, this can sound like it is Zimbabwe once again. Why or why not is this Zimbabwe all over again?
I think it's very important to put the utmost importance on the relevancy of history and the brutality and the violence that black people in this country had been able to endure. The fact of the matter is that black people are poor, they are dispossessed, they are slaves in their motherland in South Africa, particularly of colonization, because of colonization, and because of land theft, and because of institutionalized discrimination and apartheid as legislated as early as 1948 in this country. And that the 1994 negotiation process in South Africa was not able to bring justice in terms of black people as victims of oppression and apartheid in this country. So if we are to build an equal society, a true country, a just society that respects everyone in South Africa, we must come to terms with the injustices that have been committed on the part of black people. Okay. And the principal and the main injustice that had been committed on black people is their dispossession, is their oppression, is their enslavement in their mother country. And these had been materialized by the action of land theft. So land must be brought back to the black majority, and we must have conversation on how this land can be used to benefit first and foremost the black majority and whoever wants to live in this country on terms dictated to by black people. So this is in no way trying to eliminate everyone, but there is no way that we can say South Africa is first and foremost a black country, but we become junior partners in terms of defining the destiny.
Zanele, I just want to jump in because
this is a historic historical moment that needs to be addressed, and we cannot shy away on how benefit and advantage in South Africa has been defined on racial lines for a very long time.
Zanele, but my question was actually about your neighboring Zimbabwe. We saw what happened there with land expropriation. My question is that going to happen as well? Could that happen in South Africa, or are we looking at this in a completely different way? Because what happened there was a disaster.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we are having this conversation, we must also keep on our minds that we are a country and we are third world nations that find themselves embedded in what is global imperialism, and countries that belong to the West dictating terms on how Africans should live in their own continent. But I think most importantly, you know, in South Africa, the problem that we have a problem of food security, where half of the population already lives in abject poverty. And we have one of the thriving agricultural sectors in this country. So the agricultural sector that is in white hands at this point produces food, but not to feed the nation, but to import food outside the country. And as a result, the black majority, who are the rightful owners of the country, go to sleep on an empty stomach. So obviously, if we push for land expropriation without compensation, because we belong in a world that we do not rule as black people, we are going to be victimized, and we are going to get sanctioned, and we are going to get attacked on a brave stance that we are taking. But the truth of the matter,
Zanele,
this is the only solution if we are to regain our dignity as black people. I want to
bring in, thank you, Zanele. I want to bring in Ruth. I see you nodding there vigorously to everything Zanele is saying. Why?
Well, actually, I agree with a lot of what Zanele is saying, which is her analysis of the history of colonialism, apartheid, what it means, the reality that we live in a society that produces a lot of food, and yet most people are food insecure. I mean, we live in a crazily unequal society.
Thomas Walters, we have a minute left. I want to give you the last word. My question really on Zimbabwe hasn't really been answered. Are we going to see another Zimbabwe in South Africa?
Look, I don't believe I can see into the future. I most certainly think that Zimbabwe was an economic disaster. 1/3 of Zimbabweans left Zimbabwe because of the failure of the land reform process there. I agree, actually, with Professor Hall. The fact is that we need to put policies in place that can actually take us towards a successful free market. Nobody's saying that, you know, simply looking at things as it is going to fix the future for South Africa. Government needs to come up with powerful policies that can deal with the legacy that we sit with, make sure that we secure the land rights of all South Africans. A market economy is not based on the property rights of a few. It means that all the property rights of all South Africans needs to be dealt with. The real problem is that government failed to put proper policies in place. I don't believe the Constitution is the problem. It's a government that has failed and needs to be replaced by a government that can actually implement this and make it happen.
Okay, so you blame the government, not the Constitution. Okay, we'll have to leave it there. I'm afraid we've run out of time. Thank you to all three of you, Zanele Luana, Ruth Hall and Thomas Walters. Thank you to all three of you for speaking to us on The Newsmakers. Thank you. Still ahead on The Newsmakers, the United States holds talks with the Taliban, but why wasn't the Afghan government at the table? And Daesh has claimed responsibility for a deadly attack on cyclists in Tajikistan. So why is the government now blaming an opposition group? The United States has a firm stance on the Taliban and its role in Afghanistan's future, that peace must be decided among the Afghan people and only them. But in a huge shift in policy, a clandestine meeting was reportedly held in Qatar last month between Taliban officials and a US envoy, and not invited to the table, the Afghan government. The move incensed officials in Kabul. And while US President Donald Trump has campaigned on ending the Afghan and Iraq wars, is he willing to do so at the cost of angering his allies? Haider Abbasi reports.
It seems no place in Afghanistan is safe. This is an attack on a center where midwives are trained in the eastern city of Jalalabad. 3 people were killed and 7 wounded. But as the killing continues, there's talk of ending the conflict. In a reversal of official policy, the United States has held direct negotiations with the Taliban. It's the first time the two sides have met without the Afghan government being involved. They spoke in Qatar's capital, Doha, where the Taliban has a political office. For years, the insurgents have demanded direct talks with Washington. They say they can only begin talks with the Afghan government once foreign forces leave. Afghan President Ashraf Ghani has been urging the Taliban to consider a settlement.
The Taliban leadership and every other Taliban, you have the decision to make. Accept peace, accept it with honor, and come together so we can make this country safe and secure, which is the heritage of our sacrifices, jihad, and our blood.
And there have been encouraging signs. In June, the Taliban agreed to a 3-day ceasefire during the religious holiday of Eid. It was the first truce in nearly 17 years of war. There were unprecedented scenes of Afghan soldiers embracing Taliban fighters.
We don't have a problem with Afghan police and Afghan forces. We fight because there are foreigners in our country. There are Americans here. We'll fight Americans if we see them now, and we'll fight them after the ceasefire has finished.
There are many reasons why the US government would want to talk to the Taliban. After 17 years, it's the longest war in American history. The military campaign against the group hasn't worked out for the US. Under US President Barack Obama, the number of soldiers in Afghanistan reached 100,000. But that had little effect on containing the militants. The Taliban has only grown stronger. In 2001, the militants were forced out of Afghanistan. But now the group controls 59 districts, along with other insurgents such as Daesh. More than 2,400 American soldiers have been killed in Afghanistan since they invaded after the September 11 attacks in New York. And the cost to the US government has surged. According to some estimates, it's now more than $2 trillion. And the violence has been relentless. The UN says deaths reached a record high this year, with nearly 1,700 civilians killed since January. But could the talks in Doha create a breakthrough? Taliban officials say they discussed freedom of movement and the exchange of prisoners. There was also talk of the Taliban joining the Afghan government. But with the insurgents gaining more territory and strength, can they be a reliable partner in peace? And if foreign forces leave Afghanistan, will the Taliban agree to lay down its arms? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Joining me now off the coast of Alaska is David Sedney. He was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Afghanistan, Pakistan and Central Asia. And now he's a board member of the Afghan Institute for Strategic Studies. Thanks so much for joining us, David. Now, first of all, I want to kick off by asking you, now you've been involved with Afghanistan for over 15 years. So give us some perspective about the US position on these talks. Why have they now held these direct talks with the Taliban?
Well, the United States has actually held direct talks with the Taliban before in 2010, 11, and also in 13 and 15. But those talks were almost all about the release of prisoners from the Taliban's perspective. The U.S. wanted them to transition to peace talks, but the Taliban were focused on the release of prisoners. Also during that time, the United States had a very difficult relationship with then Afghan President Karzai. He believed that those peace talks were a vehicle for the United States to sell out him and his people. The level of trust between the two governments was very low. Mm-hmm. Also, overlaying everything was President Obama's pledge to pull out of Afghanistan. And so the Taliban believed that if they waited out long enough, the U.S. would leave.
So you mentioned something very interesting, that the trust was very low then between them. How is the trust now? And you've described how we've more or less been here before. So what's different, and how is the trust level now?
Well, there's one big reason, which is that the trust between the U.S. government and the U.S. administration and the Afghan government, both President Ghani and the chief executive officer, Dr. Abdullah, is much better than it was during the time of President Karzai. The two governments have worked through some very difficult times, and they still face hugely difficult issues in building a political settlement inside Afghanistan. But the trust is there, both at the top levels between President Trump and President Ghani, and at other levels such as Secretary of State Pompeo and ambassadors. Mm-hmm. So that relationship is much stronger. The second area is the United States has been putting pressure on Pakistan over the last 10 months or so. President Trump pushed Pakistan, took about $1 billion away in military aid, and that has made the situation on the ground a bit different. And then I have to add the final, and actually in some people's eyes the most important, is President Obama had a policy of timetable, setting a date, and then if that date was reached, nothing happened, he would pull out. President Trump has said that there is no timetable, that the U.S. is going to stay based on the conditions. And that has also helped change the perspective of the Taliban in Pakistan. Okay.
Now, I want to jump in and ask you, there's people that are missing here, the Afghan officials. Why are they not involved in these direct talks, being such big stakeholders in all of this?
The Taliban have made direct talks to the United States precondition for having any kind of talks since the beginning of the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan, really, in 2002. The United States has been reluctant to have such talks, and they have had them, as I mentioned, a few times in the past. But the United States has wanted the Taliban to talk directly to the Afghan government, because in the end, any peaceful settlement has to rely on Afghans talking to each other. After the pullout of the Soviet Union in the 1980s, the Mujahideen refused to talk to the then government of Najibullah. So this refusal to talk to the sitting government has been a problem for Afghan peace negotiations for a long time. Okay. These talks today are meant to springboard into talks directly between the two Afghan sides. If that happens, peace is possible. If it doesn't happen, then I don't think the talks will be successful.
And what about Pakistan? It looks like it's going to have a new prime minister very soon, Imran Khan, and he's been adamant that Pakistan should never be involved in this war. So I don't know if he's changing his position now, but how do you think you would involve Pakistan then?
Well, Pakistan has always been involved, and Pakistan has played in many cases a double-edged game, both supporting peace talks and encouraging the Taliban to continue fighting. I'm not so sure if it's the election of Imran Khan that is the determinative factor, but over recent months, the United States and the Afghan authorities have been successful in killing several Pakistani Taliban leaders fled to Afghanistan. Okay. That has been seen very positively by the Pakistani security establishment, and that may be one reason why Pakistan is more willing to have the talks go forward.
We've run out of time. I'm very sorry. David Sedney, thank you very much for your perspective and your analysis. Thank you. Well, now let's broaden out the discussion. And from Kandahar, I'm joined by Javid Faisal, and he's the former deputy spokesman for Afghanistan's chief executive. And in Madrid, we have writer Ahmed Rashid, who's authored several books on Afghanistan and the Taliban. And finally, Jeff Smith joins us from Washington, D.C., and he's a fellow at the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank. Thank you, all of you gentlemen, for joining us on The Newsmakers. Now, I want to open up the discussion and start, first of all, by asking you, Javid Faisal, what is the perspective of the Afghan government on these talks, since they're not even involved?
I believe this is a good start for the peace talks, because Taliban's only excuse for years was that they have to talk to the Americans, but mainly the current talks held between the Americans and the Taliban in Qatar are the talks for peace talks. But the actual peace talks will be with the Afghan government, and the Afghan people are hoping that Afghans should be talking to each other, not to the foreigners, because Taliban were side to the Afghan people, not the international community. Lately, their attacks have been killing Afghan civilians almost all the times. But at the end, there is hope, and the Afghan people and the Afghan government is willing to talk to the Taliban. But the American talks to the Taliban are seen as a good icebreaker for the peace talks.
Okay, a good icebreaker. I want to ask you, Ahmed Rashid, what is going through the Taliban's mind, do you think, at this time with these direct talks?
Well, very little is known about their internal status. If you remember at the last Eid, there was a 3-day ceasefire between the Taliban and the Afghan government forces. And it was an incredible moment, because actually the fighting did stop, or most of it did, and both sides adhered to the ceasefire. And one very important pointer that emerged was that clearly the Taliban are listening to their leadership, because all the Taliban groups, the commanders in the field, at some at great distance from where the leaders are, they all agreed to the ceasefire and implemented it. So that means that the Taliban are fairly united. Now, clearly on issues like peace and war and how to continue, there would have to be much greater consultation between the Taliban leaders, who are basically living in Pakistan, and the Taliban field commanders, and how the powers that be, Kabul, Washington, Islamabad, get over that hurdle is really what the next step is going to be all about. The Americans have been urging the Taliban in talks that they've had to get on with opening a dialogue with the President Ashraf Ghani's government. And clearly it's going to be the intra-Afghan talks that are really going to count. But I will say one thing, that I think it is very important that the Americans don't do this alone, because then it is likely to fail. I think what we've seen in past instances, the Bonn Accords, the Geneva Accords, it has always been outside mediation that has helped all the sides get together. And we probably need, not right now maybe, with the Americans talking to the Taliban, but when the Afghans start talking to the Taliban, I think some kind of outside mediation will be needed and required, just to make sure that the talks don't periodically collapse.
Mm-hmm. And where would that outside support come from?
Well, in the past, I mean, the two successful dialogues in Afghanistan, the withdrawal of the Soviet troops from Afghanistan, 1989, and the Bonn Accords after the American invasion of Afghanistan, 2001, 2002, they were carried out by the United Nations with the full support of the Americans, of the international community, and that is what is very important. I mean, no mediator, whether it's a country or an institution like the UN, can hope to succeed without full cooperation from all the players, and that includes the neighboring states, which are at odds with one another, and with Afghanistan. Russia, Iran, Pakistan have all been held responsible for backing the Taliban at one point, although they're also backing the government.
Okay.
So, these countries will have to get their act together and agree to some kind of mediation.
Okay. Now, Jeff Smith, you've been patiently there listening to these comments. What are your expectations for these talks? Do you think Afghans have a chance of seeing real peace anytime soon?
Well, I think if anything, this is a hopeful sign. This is something that many sides have been hoping for now for years. And the main obstacle to direct talks between the U.S. and the Taliban in the past has been, frankly, resistance from the Afghan government. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean, many in the U.S. also did not want to undermine the legitimacy of the Afghan government by engaging in direct talks with the Taliban, which is why I think it's an important and encouraging sign that officials from the Afghan government have signaled that they support this idea, that they support talks about talks. We're not negotiating a final settlement to the Afghan war. We're not negotiating key details about the Taliban's future political involvement in the government. We're sort of having talks about talks. And if that's what gets the ball rolling forward, and if the Afghan government supports that, then I think, you know, this is almost universally a positive thing. Okay. There's several very important questions that remain about where the Taliban stands in these negotiations. But I think the general sentiment here is that getting the ball moving forward on direct talks is a positive development.
But I just want to jump in there because Afghanistan had said do not have talks directly with the Taliban.
In the past, that has been the case. But when asked about the current negotiations, officials from the Afghan government have given positive signals that this is a welcome development. They do not want negotiations on a final settlement of the war. They do not want negotiations on the final settlement regarding the Taliban's future political involvement, but more basic negotiations. They're even discussing prisoner exchanges that get us to those final talks, I think should be seen as a welcome development.
So talks about talks, that's okay?
It's a step forward. Okay. I mean, I think both sides recognize that we're at a bit of a battlefield stalemate, frankly. Okay. And some kind of political resolution will be required to end this conflict.
Okay, and before we heard from our first guest, Davies Sedney, who has over 15 years of experience in Afghanistan, and he said now there was much more trust between the US and the Taliban, and he said now, because the US is not putting pressure on Pakistan in the way it did before, and there was no timetable, that there was a different relationship there. So my question is, how do you work with Pakistan, which is such an important player? That question is to you, Jeff Smith.
In fact, pressure on Pakistan has been increasing under the Trump administration. So I would say that relationship is perhaps more frayed now than it has been in the past. To me, that's one of the big outstanding questions, is what is Pakistan's role in these negotiations? What's its current relationship with the Taliban? You know, we have to remember that a lot of reports and intelligence suggested the Pakistanis have scuttled attempts by the Taliban to reach out to the Afghan government, to reach out to the Americans in the past, that the Pakistanis wanted to have a seat at the table, that they wanted to be controlling the negotiations. And when certain Taliban leaders or factions signaled that they may be willing to have talks with the Americans or Afghans, the Pakistanis got involved and scuttled those talks. So there are several outstanding questions about the relationship between Pakistan and the Taliban, about Pakistan's willingness to have these talks move forward, or its willingness to play spoiler in this. And at a time where U.S.-Pakistan relations are arguably at the worst that they've been in many years.
Okay. I want to bring in Javed Faisal again. What kind of hope do you see for negotiations with the Taliban? And is this a new Taliban? Because we heard from Ahmed Rashid that the Taliban are listening, they're united. It seems like they've almost changed a bit.
I think there are hopes now because the latest ceasefire in the Eid that we had, it has raised hopes in Afghanistan that there will be some ways opening to the peace talks with the Taliban. But the main hurdle seems to be Pakistan yet, because Taliban in the past, we have seen gestures of Taliban coming to the peace talks, but those leaders, namely like Mullah Biradar, those guys were either detained or killed in Pakistan. So again, this time, there is hope for the peace talks, but there has to be pressure on Pakistan to make sure that they do not become as a hurdle in the peace talks.
And can you put pressure on Imran Khan, sorry to interrupt, on your potentially next new prime minister? How receptive will Imran Khan be to that?
Well, people aren't very optimistic about Imran Khan because he has always been a sympathizer of the Taliban. He has been a supporter for a long time of Taliban in their stances. He has been saying that publicly the Taliban's war in Afghanistan is a jihad. So if you look at his past and what he has said about Taliban in their fight in Afghanistan, there isn't much hope. But lately, after he was elected, we have heard some positive words coming out of his mouth. But again, the state policies, the policies that has been led by the army in Pakistan, those will be effective on the outcomes of the peace talks with the Taliban. Afghans are hoping much that the U.S. will be pressuring more Pakistan to encourage Taliban or to allow Taliban to hold peace talks with the Afghan government. Again, the good peace talks will be between the Afghans. We have an example of such peace talks that had outcomes in the past. With Hizb Islami, with Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, we have had peace talks, and those were inter-Afghan dialogue, and we had the best outcome out of it. This time again, if there is any peace talks, it has to be with the Afghan government. But with the Americans, the current peace talks, that's a good icebreaker, and this will take away the only excuse of the Taliban that they want to talk to the Americans. But again, the main focus should be on Pakistan and what the Pakistan army and the intelligence service is doing. If they allow Taliban to talk, Taliban are willing to talk, they are Afghans, they will come to join their Afghan brothers for the future of Afghanistan.
Okay, and Ahmed Rashid, what do you really think that the US could deliver what the Taliban want?
Well, I mean, essentially what the US wants is an avenue which will open up between the Afghan government and the Taliban so that they can actually talk about real talks and real issues. The Americans are not going to do that for them. And the Taliban have to be told very decisively that you're not going to talk to us about the future constitution of Afghanistan or the future changes that are needed in Afghanistan or how to bring the war to an end. And one sticking point I do see in the near future is that the next move by the Taliban will be to say, well, show us some goodwill by withdrawing some of your troops from Afghanistan as quickly as possible. And that already there are very few American troops in Afghanistan. There are about 14,000 with about 3,000 to 4,000 NATO forces. And, you know, compare that to when President Obama was in office, he had 100,000 troops there. The Americans are not going to agree to that for the time being because the security situation is so vulnerable. And the American reply is likely to be, well, stop fighting and let's have a ceasefire which is a permanent ceasefire, and then we can talk about withdrawing troops. So the Taliban will want to drag out these talks with the Americans because they look good. The Taliban look like a powerful movement that has forced the superpower to its knees to talk to them, and that I don't think these American Taliban talks are going to end quickly.
Okay, and I just want to give, we have a minute left, the last word to Jeff Smith. There is an emerging threat now from Daesh. What does this do then to all this hope that we have, that we've been talking about that right now, the icebreaker, the obstacle going? You've got this big threat still here, the emerging threat of Daesh. How does this work with any potential peace talks?
Well, I think it in some ways creates further incentive for peace talks. I think when you have two parties that both have an interest in not seeing Daesh take control of Afghanistan, it provides yet another incentive for both the U.S. and the Taliban to reach some kind of settlement. And frankly, one of the key conditions and sort of red lines of the Taliban has historically over the years been no foreign military presence in Afghanistan, that this is a non-negotiable. And one of the, I think, more encouraging signs is we do seem to be getting some early tentative signals that there may be some flexibility on the Taliban's part in this regard. There's still obviously a big gap between the U.S. and the Taliban on this, but perhaps, you know, if an Afghan government with Taliban participation were to welcome the presence of an international security force, in part to keep Daesh and other foreign jihadist groups out, and in part to keep other neighboring powers from meddling in Afghanistan's affairs, there may be a set of conditions under which the Taliban could live with U.S. and other foreign troops in Afghanistan, which would satisfy one of America's core demands and help bridge one of the main gaps between the two sides.
Okay. Gentlemen, I'm afraid we've run out of time. I would have loved to have kept this going. Jabir Faisal, Ahmed Rashid and Jeff Smith, thank you all very much for speaking to us on The Newsmakers.
We are looking at all versions. That includes accident, murder, any other version. Now, we cannot say for sure that this was a terrorist attack or another type of crime. We are conducting an investigation and will keep you informed.
Now, the Tajik government says it knows the culprits of an attack on 4 tourists who were on a cycling trip last week. Officials are pointing the finger at an opposition party outlawed by the government. The tourists were killed when they were run down by a car in the country's south. The government's announcement of blame sparked controversy, though, since Daesh took credit for the attack. So, is the government trying to make its political opponents a scapegoat? Well, let's ask Mahmoujan Faiz Ramonov. He's a spokesman for the party being blamed, the Islamic Renaissance Party, and he joins us now from exile in Vienna. Thanks so much for speaking to us. Now, the question, first of all, is why is the ruling party blaming you?
Thanks for the time given to me. First of all, I want to say that we have condemned, strongly condemned the attack, and also our condolences to the families of the victims and to the countries whose citizens became the victims of this shameful event. And we are so sorry that this happened in our beloved country. Why the government blames the IRPT? It is, you know, I have two answers for this. First of all, the government of Tajikistan, when banned the party, it expected that the Islamic Revival Party would be wiped out of the political sense in Tajikistan. But the reality is that the Islamic Revival Party, with the leadership of Mr. Muhyiddin Kabiri, has re-established since the last 3 years on the, you know, and is very active in social media, in other aspects. And the Islamic Revival Party has kept the relations with the, you know, governments and the countries, especially the countries of the region.
So would they, do you think they feel threatened by you? Sorry to interrupt. Do they feel threatened by you? Is this why they're blaming you?
Just because of the popularity of the party, that the party has, after the crackdown on September 2015, has re-established itself. And also the government of Tajikistan, by blaming the party in this tragedy, wants to give a message to the Western countries that these people are terrorists and big carriers, and you know, following the ban of the Islamic Revival Party in 2017, many, yes.
I want to ask you, ISIS has claimed responsibility for this attack, so why doesn't the government believe them? Why is there this confusion?
because the government of Tajikistan wants to use this tragedy for political purpose, just to silence this peaceful opposition working in exile. This is they want.
Okay. Now, Tajikistan has said that 2018 is the year of tourism. How can you convince people that want to come to your country that, let's be fair, it's not very well known? How would you convince them? How would you convince me? I'm a runner. I also like cycling. How would you convince me to come to your country, given what has just happened, given all this confusion about who's behind it?
Yeah, unfortunately, you know, the people of Tajikistan are, you know, very hospitable nation, and we want more tourists come to our country. But unfortunately, if you see the government, when the government use this tragedy, attack on tourists for political purpose, this shows that, unfortunately, this shows that the government is not serious in handling the terrorism and fighting with, you know, terrorism. So these allegations made to you know, against the party, this shows that unfortunately the government is not so serious in, you know, in this. But we, as a nation, we want another thing that we have really you know, risks of terrorism in Tajikistan.
Okay.
We have many problems in Tajikistan, but just it is the government that wants to use this. Yes.
I'm afraid we've run out of time. I would love to speak to you more. Thank you very much for speaking to us on The Newsmakers. Now that's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Maria Ramos. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. And remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, Syria publishes a list of dead detainees. Is this a step towards reconciliation or an admission of war crimes? Until then, thanks for watching and goodbye.